Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Mahmood with you at BTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at some very important stories from around the world and some from at home. We are going to be looking at first the G-20 summit and the discussion, of course, that has been part of this particular summit, focusing much on the Ukrainian crisis. And of course, there were other important meetings on the sidelines, one of which, of course, got a lot of attention, and that was between Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping. And of course, when we take a look at the entire spectrum of discussions, a number of issues were discussed. However, from the beginning, there was a focus on the Ukrainian conflict, and we have seen that there hasn't been any sort of a joint statement coming in terms of an agreement over the opinions or perceptions regarding the Ukrainian conflict. What has come out is in terms of a joint declaration in which it has been stated that there are differing views over the Ukrainian conflict as well. But of course, there is a global view in terms of the stoppage of war or conflict, something that was echoed by the president of the G20 summit at the end, in which he spoke about various other issues that were also important as part of the summit, including financial support with regards to the pandemic and the age that the countries are dealing with, among others. This, of course, has been part of the discussions this week, and so we're going to focus on what this meant in terms of the G20 summit, in terms of what remains to be the future of Russia and how the world intends to deal with the Ukrainian crisis, in which in the recent development, of course, we've seen that there have been an increase in attacks by the Russian side, and unfortunately also something that has impacted Poland and has killed at least 2 people within Poland, and it seems to be a result of a defense from the Ukrainian side and an accident. But of course, at the end of the day, what is being talked about is that it's stemming from what has begun from the Russian invasion. So we're going to be taking a look at now in terms of the global response towards this particular crisis, and also what the G20 summit holds in terms of this and other issues. And of course, moving forward now that the G20 presidency has been given to India, what is going to be the dynamic of this particular summit next year and the kind of issues that it will cover and how it's going to be impacted by local political issues as well. That is going to be the focus in our first segment of the show today. At the end, we're also going to be taking a look at a very important story from home, where we have seen that the film Joyland was the cause of much controversy and debate in the past few days. A film that made its debut at the Cannes Film Festival is our first entry in the Oscars as well, and has won various awards, including the Jury Award at the Cannes Film Festival, in which it was first showcased. This particular film went through various approvals from the censor board that all gave their approvals after minor editing back in August. However, due to public outcry coming in from certain lawmakers as well with regards to their objections to the film, irrespective of not being able to see it, and talking about how there is content which is not in line with the values that our country upholds, there, of course, were a lot of complaints coming in from different quarters that were then taken up by the Prime Minister, who formed a review committee after, of course, a lot of the people on social media, including, of course, the very important role that has been played by the Prime Minister's head of strategic reforms, Mr. Salman Sufi, who earlier also talked to the Information Ministry, and then, of course, tweeted about the Prime Minister's decision with regards to the review committee, and also again posted on Twitter announcing the fact that after the decision of the review committee, it has been decided that the ban that was earlier put forth after the coming in of the complaints has now been lifted, and that the film will be aired all across the nation except the Punjab province, which has banned Joyland in less than 24 hours after the federal government gave it a green light. So we're going to be talking about what this means in terms of the questions it raises within the country, and of course the role played by important stakeholders, and how, as Mr. Salman Sufi has tweeted, freedom of expression is an important right that should be protected. This is going to be our focus at the end of the discussion today. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analysts Farooq Batafi and Raja Faisal. And for our first segment regarding the G20 summit, we've been joined by Professor Scott Luke, Lucas, who's a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Thank you very much, Mr. Scott, for joining us, and Tom O'Connor, senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek, both regulars at our show. So thank you very much, gentlemen, Tom and Scott, for being a part of the debate today. Let me first start with you, Faisal, to get the groundwork in terms of how important this particular summit is, and of course in terms of the kind of discussions that it has centered around. Of course, the Ukrainian conflict has been one of the main issues, but there have been other aspects with regards to the role that various countries have played or will play in the future as well, especially with regards to India as well, and the way that we have seen that there have been differing opinions from various world leaders as to how exactly will they go ahead with the evolving situation in Russia. What do you make of the overall discussion, the fact that we did not really have a consensus at this point?
Sana, if we talk about G20 this year's in Bali, of course we were expecting results related to obviously climate change as well from the G20 countries. But if we look at it right now, of course, as Russia has pointed out, that it was unwarranted politicization of the G20 summit this year. As they have said that the focus was entirely on Ukraine crisis, and we know that there is a division within G20 on the fact that the condemnation of Russia is not given this year. And the very next fact, which is very important, is that of course India is going to preside over it, preside over G20 now, and we are already getting controversial statements from Indian side that they are going to hold it in Kashmir, which of course not only Pakistan but the other G20 members would be having concerns related to it as well. We know that India, especially the government, the ruling party BJP, is trying to coin it sort of that we are going to hold it in Kashmir, which of course it would turn out to be a problem in coming days. We just need to wait for the time when they announce it. But of course these are the important things which we are seeing for the next G20 summit. But so far the current one, of course there is a clear division on the current crisis, Ukraine crisis, and all we can hope that the mighty countries of the world, they can sit together and come to results.
Right. Scott, considering that the divisions were talked about and highlighted in the statement that has come out, what exactly do you make of it? Is this a development that can pan out well or worse for different countries, especially with regards to how it's going to impact Russia? And then moving forward, also considering that there seems to be some sort of consensus in the more generic statement that there shouldn't be war or there shouldn't be conflict, instead of outright condemnations regarding the Ukrainian conflict, how will that help in terms of actually providing a sort of resolution or end to the suffering that is going on?
First of all, no one expected a joint communique from the G20. And I think, I'll see what Tom thinks about this, but no one expected a communique where China and India would join everyone else in condemning the Russian invasion. That's just not going to happen because of the way that China and India are playing the diplomatic, almost fence sitting here at this point. What was significant is to go the level below that. And I'd put it 2 points just to start off the discussion. The first is, the fact is that China and India did not stand in the way of a joint declaration. It doesn't carry the same weight as a joint communique. But if you look at that language of the joint declaration, it was made explicit that a majority of the G20 did condemn the Russian invasion. And indeed, the word barbaric was thrown around quite a bit at the summit, that the majority did support Ukraine's right to territorial integrity and sovereignty. And of course, there was that reference that I think all concerned shared, which is we need to get back to food security and energy security, which is threatened by the conflict. I think the second significant point is you go a level below that is you go to the statements from the individual national leaders. Now, India was very, very cautious. They put the focus, as you know, on diplomacy. look to the G20 to succeed where the UN has failed. They weren't going to say boo to a goose. China, however, was different with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, first of all, did come out and condemn the prospect of nuclear war. And that was very much a message to Moscow that he was on side with the West regarding some of the nuclear threats that Vladimir Putin has made. Secondly, Xi again came back to those important words, sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is a signal to Moscow, we're not going to continue to support this invasion for you to overrun Ukraine. We're not going to side with the West on sanctions. We're not going to side with the West in putting pressure on you. We would like to see this go to negotiations, but you cannot expect us to continue supporting your military effort. And so where are we at the G20? When everybody goes home, Russia is getting military support from two countries, Iran and North Korea, something that Tom's just written about. And Iran and North Korea is not exactly giving you a firm international position if you're going to continue to prosecute this war with a view to winning, as opposed to find a way to get some type of talks to save face when Russia is in effect losing on the battlefield.
Right, absolutely. And Tom, I'd like you to, of course, talk more about that as well. But in terms of the kind of impact that we were hoping from the G20 summit, of course, what has been outlined in terms of the condemnations that have come in to a certain extent, how will that actually affect the way that things have been developing, especially in the recent week with what is going on in Ukraine, when at the sidelines of such summit or in terms of bilateral engagements, there are the kind of interactions in terms of military support already going on. And it seems that at the end of the day, despite the previous sanction as well, the kind of conflict that we see in Ukraine seems to be only rising and not moving away from any sort of escalation. And so in those terms, it seems that perhaps the kind of possibility or objective from the Ukrainian side of not really allowing any sort of Russian elements within their territory seem to be a bleaker and bleaker possibility. Is that so?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the notion I got from the interactions at the G20 summit, as well as the statements put out, as well as just the general tone of conversations going on, is a fatigue with this conflict. I think that, it's 1 year ago at this time, there was already the talks of a potential conflict breaking out. Russian troops were already surrounding Ukraine's borders, also in Belarus. And what I see now is just a realization that this conflict cannot end with a military victory. Now, I know that things have gotten more positive for Ukraine in some senses, in certain key areas and certain key front lines, but the idea that Ukraine will win this conventionally is also a very difficult notion to accept. So the only solution then, this is something that President Zelensky had said himself in previous eras of the conflict, is that there needs to be a diplomatic solution of some sort. There needs to be diplomacy to end this war. Now, of course, the how that diplomacy works is not yet a consensus among the parties, not just the belligerents of the war, but even the G20 members themselves. But what I saw, I think, is a development in this sense, is that not only are the two parties themselves getting tired of this conflict, but also their international supporters. That goes to the West, with wanting to see some sort of diplomatic solution, but it also goes to China, I believe, too. I think that what we're seeing right now is China saying we need to bring this to a close. Now, I don't think this means a break in the China-Russia strategic partnership necessarily. I don't see that being the case in the immediate or short term. But what I do see is China saying we also need to look out for our own national interests. China is the major partner, the senior partner in that relationship, just because of economy. And its interconnectivity to the world. So I think that also in a bid to, I think, improve relations with the West, we've seen something of a development there. Now, these things don't happen overnight. People are dying every day in Ukraine, so it's a sad fact that these things will not happen quickly. As Scott said, that we're not going to see a statement. I didn't expect one, but there were conversations had that we don't have full visibility on that clearly signaled some sort of movement on this front. And I think that's very significant.
Right. Farooq, what Tom was earlier talking about in terms of the kind of fatigue that perhaps exists, and the way that we need to move towards a more diplomatic solution to it, and perhaps that is the only one if we really look at the way that conflicts evolve. But at the end of the day, at this moment, will this be something that can actually be a sort of driving force behind actually moving towards that? Because at the end of the day, what we're seeing now is there may be fatigue, but there may also be a step back from any sort of efforts towards moving towards the diplomatic solution. It seems that perhaps the way that the international community is viewing the Ukraine conflict or interacting with Russia, they seem to be stepping back from any sort of diplomatic effort. Is that so?
Right, Sana, and I think it is a $1,000,000 question. At this moment, what is at stake, was at stake at Bali and elsewhere as well, is the idea of collective security. Remember that we keep on talking about fault lines. Certainly, Ukraine is a big one, and that is there. And people are dying, as Tom so pithily actually put it. But despite all those deaths and everything, it is one small part of the whole, and that is global, the Committee of Nations. And the concern at this moment is that we have been actually building up these various intergovernmental procedures to actually ensure that there is diplomacy, there is ability to not resort to war, and then actually work on peace and solve problems that are there. Unfortunately, it seems that because these flashpoints actually keep getting ignited, because of that kind of unity among nations, especially the most powerful, may it be G7, may it be G20, may it be UN, they all are crumbling down. And that frightens me, Sana. I know everybody here is wearing the Pandit cap. I'm going to actually wear the cap with which I was born, and that is the cap of a common man. What does a common man hate or worry about? It is uncertainty. At this moment, UK has already stated its Chancellor of Exchequer that the country is already in recession. And then we have seen there was an unfortunate signaling coming from President Putin regarding use of nukes, although their ambassador later on cleared it up in the US that they are not going to resort to any kind of nuclear attack. But the uncertainty is there. Similarly, another fault line that came into sharp relief was China-Canada, fault line. That is a big one as well. It sort of takes me back to a day, when India claimed that it has conducted a surgical strike in Pakistan, and when we woke up, we didn't know what exactly is going to happen tomorrow, whether there is going to be a nuclear war, whether there is going to be a fight or something of that sort. And that frightened me for the first time. I love my daughters, but I looked at them and I thought that whether it was a wise decision to bring them into this world, if they are going to be subjected to such wars. So this kind of fear at this moment, remember, Russian people, Ukrainian people did not get a vote to decide whether there should be a war. Similarly, UK did not get a vote to decide whether there should be any recession. But we are sleepwalking into this hazardous place where it can all collapse and civilization can be subjected to something that we cannot sustain.
Right, absolutely. And of course, that's cause of much worry and concern. We'll continue the discussion after a short break. Welcome back to the debate. We're talking about the G20 summit and the discussion that centered around the Ukrainian conflict. And of course, there have been various opinions with regards to what exactly can be done from this point onwards. Faisal, I believe you had a question.
Yes, Sana, I had a question. Obviously, I want to ask Professor Scott. Professor Scott, very beautifully, if we just go through the comment which is made by Farokh, he has highlighted an aspect, obviously, of being things are very uncertain in today's Europe. You being in Europe, of course, you are in a best position to tell us about it. Obviously, in context of missiles are being dropped in Poland, fired from within Ukraine, and Poland being one of the NATO countries, how important this is right now in the current scenario, number one. And number two, we know since the day one, of course, China was playing its role to bring both of the parties on the table to negotiate peace. Right now, of course, they might be still doing it, but can we expect from somewhere from within Europe to play that kind of role in coming days? And if not, then how serious Europe itself is about restoring peace in Europe, sir?
Well, a couple of very good questions. First, I'll take the specific of the incident with the missile that was downed in Poland. While it adds to the uncertainty, I don't think it changes the fundamentals of the conflict. And the reason why I say that is going on, I think what is probably the case, that this was a Ukraine air defense missile which went astray. The cause for this, the responsibility for this is still with Russia. If Russia doesn't carry out the largest missile attacks across Ukraine in the course of this conflict, firing almost 100 missiles on Tuesday, then the Ukraine air defense doesn't have to respond. So I don't think that shifts the blame, as it were. I don't think it puts Ukraine on the defensive over what happens. Indeed, I think of what may actually happen. And we've already seen this from Sweden responding by providing an air defense system to Ukraine, is that Ukraine gets more assistance to back itself, defend itself from the Russian missile attacks. Now, on the wider question about, getting to negotiations, getting to the diplomatic table, whether it's through China, whether it's through Europe, Farouk talked about sleepwalking. Here, I think we've got to be eyes wide open. Point one, there is one person who is the barrier to negotiations. There is one person who's the barrier to getting talks started. And he's the person who started this war. And that's Vladimir Putin. Until Vladimir Putin wants some type of talks, until he is in a position where he thinks he can't win this on the battlefield, there's not going to be diplomacy. With all the respect for those who want it and understand why. Point two, we're not going to get talks unless the precondition is fulfilled, that Russian forces withdraw from Ukrainian territory, with the exception of the Crimean Peninsula, which they've held in 2014. Because the point is that Ukraine's going to come back and say, we cannot start these talks with Russia having an advantage, having leverage from having forces who invaded earlier this year, especially when the belief is, and I think justifiable, that Russia could use talks not to try to seek a resolution to this, but to try to recover militarily. So those are the first 2 points. And I think the third point is this, and that is, throughout this process, Ukraine has put positions on the table for negotiations. In March, in the one face-to-face talks that came out of Turkey at the end of March, they put forth a 15-page plan for discussion, and Moscow kicked it aside because they thought they could win at this point. Zelensky last week put 10 points on the table for discussion. I think the Americans and the Europeans have gone to Zelensky and they said, look, don't say publicly that you will never negotiate. Don't say publicly you'll never negotiate if Putin is still in power, because you have to leave the possibility up for talks. But I think they know realistically. That until Putin is pushed to the side, we don't get those discussions.
Right. Tom, when we consider the situation, of course, and as you said earlier, the fact is that the conflict is, of course, ongoing, and there are people who are suffering as a result of it while we think about any sort of possible resolution or try to move towards it. But at the end of the day, when we talk about the issues such as what happened in Poland and the fact that, of course, the overall responsibility remains with Russia and the kind of condemnations that have come in earlier or seem to be coming in now as well, that may be important in terms of the role that they play, but they're still just condemnations. And so while, as Scott was saying, that we see this continuing and the possibility of negotiations with Putin to be very, very low and in fact maybe an impossibility. And so considering all of these things that are real and true, and moving away from what should be done or what needs to be the ideal way forward, how exactly do you think will this conflict evolve now moving forward, considering that it's been quite a while, as you said earlier, considering that Putin is still in power, considering that all that we have seen coming in from various world leaders, even at the G20 summit, are words. And so what exactly will be the future of Ukraine? Because we can say all we want that this is not something that's legal, but they're there and the attacks are happening.
Well, with the caveat earlier, the point made about uncertainty, certainly that leads into my response here, because it is very uncertain what's coming next. Each day, obviously is a realm of possibilities. Things could happen. It's a very volatile situation, and the point earlier also made about the missile defense. I believe it was a S-300 or something like that. At least that's what experts are saying, that fell into Poland. Just goes to show the nature of this conflict. The idea that there were world leaders, their defense minister of one of the Baltic countries, I believe it was, immediately said it was a Russian missile. There was U.S. intelligence officials saying that. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. There were people talking about Article 4, which would give more air defense to Ukraine. So that's all a preface to say that these things are really changing day to day. Now, that being said, there were also, I believe, and this is important to know, a lot of assumptions about this conflict made before it even began that were proven wrong almost immediately and then consistently throughout it. And, part of that, it was U.S. intelligence officials saying that not expecting Ukraine to put up such a great defense as they have across the country. And then as the conflict sort of evolved, there was an assumption that Russia would at least militarily be able to attain control of the 4 provinces or regions that it annexed through an internationally, of course, unrecognized referendum back in September, I believe it was. That also is proving to be much more difficult to Russia than previously expected. So the idea was that if Russia could walk away at least with those 4 provinces, perhaps, and of course Crimea, which is probably not going to be up for much discussion, then perhaps there could be some sort of end to the conflict. One that, of course, is completely unacceptable for Ukraine, but at least there would be an understanding of where Russia was coming from. Now, Russia is fighting for on the front lines of those provinces, of course, Kherson being one of the most precarious for Russian positions, but it does not have full control of any of those regions now. So Ukraine, President Zelensky has put out his full sort of expectations that he wants to beat Russia conventionally, or at least have all Russian troops withdraw from pre-2014 borders. Okay, that's Ukrainian position.
Tom,
I'm not 100%.
There are two very important cities, Mariupol and Odessa.
Yes,
of course, we know that Russia was obviously focusing just to blockade Ukraine from the Black Sea. Don't you think that Russia would be putting that on table as well?
Absolutely. So what I was going to say, though, is we don't know exactly what Russia's end game here in this conflict is. And I believe it's because it's still evolving as the situation evolves on the ground, as reality sets in. What is Russia looking to get out of this? They've proven unable to beat Ukraine conventionally on the battlefield. And of course, now the narrative has changed. They're not just fighting Ukraine, they're fighting all of the West, which is true to some extent, honestly. But the end result is the same, that Russia cannot overthrow the Ukrainian government. It cannot keep control of the provinces it seeks in Ukraine. So what is the end game here? And until that question is answered, until we have both sides' positions, even if they're maximalist positions, the first, get in the door position, we're not really sure what happens next.
Right. Tom, I want to explore this a little further as well in terms of the kind of options that there are. Farouk, considering what was earlier said about Putin as well, and in terms of course, when we take a look at any conflict, irrespective of this one, there seems to, if there is a party who's not willing to negotiate or not willing to enter into dialogue, what sort of options exist for other parties, not just the one in conflict, but others in the international community, to actually make that happen? Of course, there's the issue of sanctions, but you have questioned about how far can we actually go and benefit from sanctions to actually bring in somebody on the negotiating table. What sort of a cost will Russia not be able to bear, or Putin not be able to bear, for him to come to the negotiating table. And if it's not something that the international community can actually do, will the conflict inevitably evolve into something, or can possibly become something that's an out of hand situation, or come to a point where then Russia will be forced to back off?
Right, and when Sana, this Poland thing happened, actually, it was disclosed. It was fog of war. We did not know who actually had launched that missile. One did worry that there is the potential of escalation, that Russia might be at war with the entirety of Europe. And that was frightening possibility, because uncertainties circle keeps on increasing. Remember, Europe at this moment, because winters have started, Europe is worried about the need to heat, Europe for the common people, right? That becomes a issue because fuel is also online. And in that situation, what I garnered from Professor Lucas and also Tom's comment, it really worries me, because it is really correct direction. We don't know what Russia's end game is, and that frightens me, because Russia, especially Russian president, there was a time when he was open to any kind of negotiations, and of late we have seen people like Alexander Dugin actually taking over the influential part in Moscow, and then you don't know what exactly comes next. It could be a suicide mission that is meant to actually bring down the entire West, because they now think that they are Eurasian and they have their eastern roots as well. These concerns are going to get bigger. Remember, we have become a populace of 8 billion. 8 billion child was born a couple of days ago. And at that moment, let me borrow two titles of books, and they are very important references. Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature actually documents how violent humanity was and how badly we were fighting, and now gradually we have moved towards less violent societies, which was great until you threaten everything, and that becomes a possibility. The second term earlier, doctors or professors actually was mentioning eyes being wide open. Let me do better. Let me borrow a term from Mark Fisher, whose book Ghost of My Life is very good, commentary on our circumstances, and the term is slow cancellation of the future. Remember, the kids who are being born at this moment are not like us, who were either born in a bipolar world or then a unipolar world. These kids are going to see a world that is really fractured, where you don't know how you are going to get energy and food. These are concerns. I understand what Russia might be doing and how it actually poses or becomes an obstacle. But the collective imagination of the West and democracies and the world, why is it stopping here? Why hasn't it found a way? I mean, if there was a palace intrigue and Putin was overthrown, one would have understood something was happening.
Right.
But at this moment, you don't know what kind of uncertain times we are going to go into. There can be a slow simmering for decades. What are you going to do then? So there has to be some solution, some way to actually bring President Putin back to talks. I don't know. I cannot speak for the 8 billion people. I assume that humanity has better collective conscience than my single one.
Yeah, and going further into obviously G20's performance, Professor Lucas, we know that of course India is going to preside over G20 now. The same India that bought S-400s last year from Russia, the same India that is still buying 100,000 barrels per day crude oil from Russia. Of course, that is adjusting the economic affairs of Russia, and continuously procuring their arms from Russia. It's the same India, and it is going to preside over G20. How would you assess its performance, G20's performance in coming years, sir?
I can't even fully assess G20's performance this year, so I don't want to project into the future. But what I will do is let me give you a scenario. And we're not supposed to project things. That's always a very risky business. But I'll give you a few things to look out for and get back to the G20. First of all, uh, food and energy, of course, are going to be huge issues for us. But already, I think you see signs of the world adjusting or trying to deal with this. Remember, today we've got a 4-month extension, which was agreed by all sides to extend the lifting of the Russian blockade on Ukraine's ports. Now, Russia didn't want to lift that blockade, they wanted to renew it, but they had no choice but in the end to accept that extension. Secondly, and I'm here in Britain, and you know we're getting at the sharp end of what is happening with energy, primarily because of our incompetent government. But much of Europe has made preparations to buffer the shock of what is happening with energy. You talk about LNG terminals, you talk about moves to bringing back, although it has climate consequences, coal-fired plants to get through this winter. So, I don't think that support for Ukraine is going to break because of the energy issue. And here's the big thing I'm going to project, and I'll get back to G20. Conflicts are not necessarily lost with a full military defeat. They're lost when countries are exhausted. That's how World War I ended. That indeed is how Vietnam ended, when both South Vietnam and to an extent the US were exhausted. This conflict probably ends when Russia is exhausted, in terms of not only military defeat, but in terms of the economic constriction that it's going through. But I think that raises the open question, which is beyond India and the G20, because we know what India will say, democracy, 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 without putting substance behind it. Farouk's absolutely right, that when Russia loses this conflict, and I believe it will, what happens if Putin is pushed aside? What comes next? We'll go back to a moment which in general I would say is a 1991 moment, not 1989, 1991. When there was the attempted coup in Moscow, and we didn't know if it would go to hardliners or if it would go to a different type of pragmatic leadership, such as Boris Yeltsin. That's going to be the great uncertainty that we have to deal with. And I think all the G20 can do is what Tom mentioned, which is it's not going to come through official communiques. It's not going to come even through official declarations. It'll be those talks behind the scenes amongst various leaders, which is, look, we've got to try to limit the shock, even if we can't provide certainty at this moment.
Very true.
Right, absolutely. Tom, considering the fact that when we take a look at the cause of the conflict ending to be exhaustion, isn't that something of a failure at the end of platforms such as the G20 summit or others, where the international community gets together and talks about issues of big conflicts? If they only have to end in terms of exhaustion and at the hands of course, a lot of suffering that is witnessed and experienced by the people. And if that is so, even if in that case we see Russia actually losing the conflict, will they be the only losers there? Because there's so many others who would have lost much.
Excellent question.
Sure. Yes, that is a great question. I don't see it as a failure at the G20 because I think short a global military intervention, that's something that of course would not happen. There is no other way to end it unless, you can't force Russia into diplomacy. You just can't. It's a decision at the end of the day Russia will have to make one way or another. Unless it defeats Ukraine or unless it is defeated, as Professor Scott said. This is something that is inevitable at some point. There will be an end to this conflict. It could go on for years. We shouldn't expect this to happen even over the course of next month. We don't know when this conflict will end, and conflicts go on a long time. And just because it seems so new to us doesn't mean that it's going to end anytime soon. I do want to make a point to multipolarity, though. I think that it's certainly indicative of these times right now that not only was the United States with a unprecedented mostly Western coalition unable to prevent this conflict, it's also unable to end it by itself. It needs to reach out to other countries. India has to be a part of this. China has to be a part of this. And at some point, Russia's going to have to be a part of some part of it too. And so I think that it's really indicative of where we are right now as an international community. Perhaps the mechanisms that governed international relations and conflict prevention in past decades and eras are no longer not necessarily applicable, but they need to be adapted Perhaps the conversations do not reach across the table before. Perhaps we need to think bigger and talk and have more uncomfortable conversations with people we're not familiar talking to in order to prevent
Absolutely,
this sort
Tom.
of thing
And
from
we really
happening
hope that
again.
we can actually get around to doing that. Unfortunately, I'd have to interrupt. We're out of time, but thank you very much, Scott, and thank you very much, Tom, for being a part of the debate and talking to us about this very important issue. We'll take a small break and continue our discussion with the second segment of the debate. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the debate. We're now going to be talking about the very important decision that has come out to lift the ban that was earlier imposed on the release of the film Joyland, that was even previously approved by the censor board. That was done back in August, and then we saw that there were some complaints that came out from certain sections in the society talking about how it is not in line with the values of our country. And so because of that, there was a ban that was imposed, and then because a lot of the people raised their voices for this particular film that was part of the Cannes Film Festival, won the jury award, is the official entry of Pakistan into the Oscars, is now again of course been reviewed by a special committee according to the directions of the Prime Minister, and the censor board once again reviewed this particular film and approved its release after editing certain bits, and it is set to release tomorrow. So we're all really glad that this decision has come out, and finally we get to see a movie that we can be truly proud of, that we should be truly proud of, considering the amount of pride that it has given to the country all over the world, and the kind of a reception that it has received from various parts of the world. What of course is important here is to also discuss the issue that has been highlighted by Mr. Salman Sufi, who has tweeted about this particular issue. He has been at the forefront of bringing this into the notice of the Prime Minister and the Information Ministry, and of course has played a pivotal role in the decision that has come out earlier today as well. And he has talked about the importance of freedom of expression. He's talked about how everybody, including the filmmakers and the critics, need to be able to express their point of view, and that he has seen the film and that there's nothing in it that is tantamount to any sort of objection or not in line with the values of our country. Farooq, if we take a look at all of this that has happened, of course, it is an important victory to celebrate, not just in terms of what the Prime Minister, of course, has decided on this matter and taken action for, but also in terms of how we've seen a lot of public support behind this particular film as well, and for people coming out and talking about how important it is for Pakistan to be able to celebrate such films, or the kind of effort that is being put in various aspects. So when we take a look at today's decision, what do you make of it in terms of what Mr. Salman has also said, and of course the way that the people have reacted to their right to actually be able to celebrate their own cinema?
Right, absolutely, Sana. I think that whenever you talk about victory, first of all, you have to celebrate the knights in shining armor. And our knights in shining armor is Salman Sufi Saab, and also Prime Minister, who actually took this notice, who decided, who put their foot down. You know, every society has its own regressive elements, and they want to curtail freedom of expression and freedom of imagination. That has been going on in this country, and this disease is now afflicting even West, especially on this issue, and we are going to talk about it. There are three issues at hand here. The first one is transfer rights, right? The second one is denial, and the third one is censorship, or the right to tell a story. Now, the first one is, of course, when you talk about trans rights, I think they are an issue all over the world at this moment. Even in the US, we have seen that political parties start falling apart when it comes to trans rights. So there is, that actually takes us to the second part, which is denial. Because in societies, even Western societies, there is denial in countries like ours, where trans people have existed for many, forever actually, and they are supposed to have their rights. Amazing that this mental block or this blind spot we have created, that they can be subject of humor, jest, they can be part of performances at weddings, but they cannot be a part of the society. Why would that be? Why are you taking exception to how God has created human beings? So this denial has to go. And that means that they should get their identity and they should have a voice in everything. Their stories should be told as well. And finally, this denial then leads to our repeated efforts to censor. In West, they have created this very imaginative system of actually defining age groups which can watch any story, right? And that is great, because when I go to a video store, I used to, or then I go to Netflix, there is a description that it can, the movie might not be suitable for children younger than 15 or 12, or then it is parental guidance, right? That actually creates these streamlines where you can actually have choose, and then you can have adult conversation.
Right.
When in South Asia, like India, our neighbor has done this denial and thinking that everyone has to be parentally supervised or guided to watch a movie. When you have that kind of censorship, what happens? Then even in children's movies, you get those dance numbers which are really, really unimaginative and offensive. So you have to someday realize that the right of people to tell their story and the right of people to watch or listen to that story is their right, and the state should not be actually dictating, especially listening to the regressive elements who have done this for quite some time, and that is why this country has not been able to move forward in any direction. For heaven's sake, I mean, a substantial part of your society was not even represented in your television, your dramas, your movies, your songs.
In our census.
And that was only because of these censors and these people. Why should that be?
Absolutely, and these are big question marks, and we're glad, of course, that this conversation at least is happening, and that, of course, the government and the Prime Minister is on the right side of the conversation. Faisal, when we take a look at all of this, and especially the issue of freedom of expression, seems that perhaps there is something that is being tried to achieve in terms of curbing certain voices, in terms of making sure that certain people, particularly transgenders, are not really seen as human, because of course there have been roles played by transgenders in art and in the film industry, even in Pakistan. But
on margins,
on margins, or as you were saying earlier, as a form of ridicule or humor, not in terms of their own expression, not in terms of looking at them as humans. And this is of course something that we fail to do as a society as well every single day, and such films are only contributing to change that. So why is it that this is seen as something that is of danger to the society?
Sana, I don't know why, but we have somehow created so many taboos around us. We do not talk about them issues. I think we need to start talking about all of the issues which our society, today's society, is facing. And it is, I'm glad to see that Censor Board has taken this unprecedented step. They face the pressure by the public, but they have went against all the odds, and they have made this decision.
Right, absolutely. I'll have to cut you there, Faisal, because we're really out of time. But of course, we're all very, very happy with this decision, and we're so glad that the Prime Minister took this initiative and done the right thing.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, of course, and good luck to the filmmakers. And of course, we get to see the films tomorrow in all parts of the country except in Punjab, but we hope they come around too. That's all that we have from the debate. See you tomorrow.